So I want to talk, as far as newspapers go, I just want to talk about a few things, kind of modern issues with them, and then I'll be done with newspapers. But there's a few things that are kind of, I mean, one of the biggest things about newspapers is that they are, um, is in the modern age is that they depend highly upon advertising. And advertising, when the recession happened in '06, '07, it was '07-ish, it began right before Obama was elected, right at the end of the Bush presidency, and right at the end of that, and right at the beginning of the Obama presidency, we went into a housing crisis, and it collapsed, and we had a major recession. Before that, when that happened, advertising just dried up because housing was a big advertiser and housing collapsed. People who were losing their homes weren't out buying diamonds, and they weren't out buying jewelry and watches. They weren't out buying cars. People were not buying. And so people quit advertising very quickly to save money, because what's the point of advertising to people who aren't buying? So after that, newspapers had a bottom fall out. They ended up cutting the number of reporters, which then some people saw as kind of committing suicide. I would probably be in the ballpark of saying that there's some truth to that, but that's what they had to do to survive, as well as the others having to cut advertising. At the same time, the online was emerging, and online advertising was actually growing, because if people were going to put money out there, they wanted to at least they were going to try this new thing. The things that were growing were a lot of digital platforms, and so the online marketing, online advertising was a growing area. And so one of the complaints is that they kind of replaced the print, which they charge dollar upon dollar. It's 10, $30 for a little ad, like this big, and they changed it over to charging, 10 cents for a full banner ad or something on 1,000 imprints or something. And so they ended up making less money, doing a lot of work to make less money. They didn't make the same amount of money on that, on each story or each thing. They weren't able to generate the same kind of revenue. And so that became a very serious concern, and newspaper companies cut back because they had no other choice but to cut back. That was also multiplied with the fact that during this time, during the 80s, newspapers began to develop online methods for... So it became the case that you could go from, like, now if you want to make a newspaper plate, the thing that they put on the press to put down and punch the print onto the page, and they can do 10, 20,000 of these an hour, 1,000 a minute for big presses, just cycling it through. Used to, you had to, like I said, you had to pay, they had to put in each one of those little pieces of type, and they had to lock it in place, and this was very time consuming. Well, then the computer came along, they were able to print it out, and then they were able to kind of put it on an imager, and they were able to take a picture of that and then use that to print a plate. Then they realized that they didn't even need to print it out. They could actually print it directly onto a piece of film and then, make the plate. And then they got to the point they didn't even need somebody to actually do anything with film, and they can just print it directly onto the plate. There's just, the guy in the newsroom hits print, and the thing pops out the back as a metal plate. I mean, it takes, 5 minutes or 10 minutes for the processors to do it, but, they can just pop it out the back end. As a result, each one of those decreased the number of people. Decrease the number of people, decrease the number of people, decrease the number of people. And so what previously you would need at night 100 people working in the back room putting in little pieces of metal, now you can do with one person back there taking the plates out of the machine, putting it on, moving the paper in, and throwing it, hitting the on switch. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it because it does take, probably, a large press would take a dozen people, a small press, couple, it kind of depends. But the idea there is it does not take the same amount of labor to put out the paper. And as a result, newspapers during the 80s and 90s, realizing this, the ones who were the larger corporations realized that if they bought small papers, they could put in efficiencies and they could actually increase the profits. And so they were willing to pay more and more and more and more and more and more and more for papers. And the idea was they could then, they could even, with the internet, with the advent of the internet, they were able to take, for example, if I'm sitting here in Springfield and I want to print the paper, I can actually just send the paper and hit print, and it'll print out the plate in Peoria, which is what they do now. And then they put it on the printing press in Peoria, print it out, and they ship the paper back down to Springfield, which is what they do on every single night. And so what happens is because of that, you don't have to have a press room in Springfield. You don't have to have all the hundreds of workers you used to have here. You can just have some in Peoria. And there, instead of having hundreds, you can have 10 people who do what used to take, probably 100 people in Springfield and 100 people in Peoria and 100 people in Bloomington and 100 people in Galesburg. And, what previously took hundreds of people, 300-400 people, now can be done by 10 people at the most, 5 people probably. And they can manage it all. And what before with copy editing and line editing, instead of having 10 people there, you can have 2 or 3. And so what happens is because of this, it all became cheaper and more efficient, and the profits were, and it drove up the cost of papers. And then what happened is, because newspapers were selling for a lot more money, and the printing press itself is also a savings, because the printing press in Peoria, I actually worked at that newspaper when they were building it. It cost $30 million to build the printing facility there. But if they were to build that facility here for $30 million, one in Bloomington for $30 million, one in Galesburg for maybe $10 million, maybe one somewhere else for $10 million, all the different papers they would print, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's a big savings by this digitization, by the computer networks that allow this to happen. Now, with that said, with the millions and millions of dollars, with that said, the $30 million, what all that's going to cost, we have to, with all the savings, the prices went up. And as a result, they financed these things. And then when the market fell and advertising disappeared, that kind of caused the entire market to collapse. And that is a big impact on advertising. Now they've moved more to online. Online seems to be where it's growing, but it's just not the same market, and they're yet to completely get a hold of it. But people are becoming more and more comfortable with reading their paper online. The problem is the advertising revenue is not there. As far as other things that happen in newspapers, the same thing has happened with this is the fact that people now get their news from other places, so people aren't going to buy 2 or 3 newspapers today. As a matter of fact, they don't even feel the need to buy one newspaper, and so you have fewer newspapers. But it's also the case that there's conglomeration. There's vertical integration that one company has always done the entire process, but there's now horizontal integration in the sense that the same company Gatehouse owns the Springfield paper. They'll buy the paper in Lincoln, and they'll buy the paper somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else, and they'll then combine these newspapers, and they'll know now, instead of if you own the Lincoln newspaper and you own the Springfield paper, well, why would you need to publish send a reporter from Springfield to cover something in Lincoln when you can just send your reporter in Lincoln? And so what happens is, one of the complaints is the news becomes less diverse, that it becomes just one person covering it, and they don't worry about getting it as accurate. They don't worry about doing it right. There's less people, checking the government. There's fewer watchdogs, and that's one of the complaints, is that the conglomeration has led to more conglomeration. So those are some of the complaints. There's a lot more, and we could discuss those quite a bit. Some of the discussion board will get into a few of those things, but that's kind of newspapers in a nutshell. Newspapers, to a large degree, are what has become kind of the modern day just journalism in general. And now, newspapers are not so much the news print version. That's quickly going away, but the journalism is getting replaced, and those same issues that probably are things we should just talk about with journalism in general, but how you categorize that, probably online news probably should be its own chapter at some point. Or its own unit in this, and we could talk more about specific issues about media accuracy, media proliferation, media, fewer watchdogs, things like that.